We have landlords who can read and write. There's an interesting set of texts that come from a moderately wealthy landlord. So again, this means literacy has spread to multiple classes. Formation of the letters has become very consistent. So this, again, this is a sign of a society that's become literate, not one or two people, 10 scribes in the palace, because you find the same shape of the letter throughout the kingdom. You find consistent spelling throughout the whole territory of ancient Israel. When you put all of this together, consistent spelling, consistent letter formation, and writing coming from the middle classes, this to me indicates literacy, but schools. Somebody's going to school to learn how to spell, to learn how to write their letters. But at the same time, if you look at what the writing is, and we have thousands now of inscriptions, they're all letters or receipts. Most of them are receipts or bills of sale. There are no examples of literature, nothing even remotely like literature. And in part, this is because of the medium. There are some things down here. These are cuneiform tablets, but the size is similar. What you have from ancient Israel are mostly ostraca. An ostraca is a broken piece of pottery that someone is now using as a medium to write. And you can't really accommodate literature on a piece of ostraca. Ostraca are very useful for something that you want to preserve for a short amount of time and then throw away. So, yeah, these aren't ostraca, but picturing something about this size. You write something on this that you don't need for a long time. Yes, I paid you for the barrel of grain, and the receipt is done. We don't have long literary texts. We don't have poetry. We don't have any of these things. In part, they couldn't have been accommodated. But if you put this together with what we know about Egypt, Greece, Mesopotamia, and these other places, I think you can come to the conclusion that the literature is being handed on orally. And that while people may well expect a written receipt when they deliver the grain, if they're going to hear a story, they expect to hear it orally, even if it's a piece of literature that everyone knows and that is quite famous. I've found then a window of a picture of a society that I wanted to know more about. A society where literacy is taking off, where it's spread to the middle classes, where there's this consistency and you have all of these economic documents, but at the same time, literature is being passed on pretty much entirely orally. It's not oral and written at this point. And what I did is I looked for other places where that situation has obtained or does obtain. And the best analogy I came to was Iceland. I have some other analogies as well out of Arabia, and to an extent the Homeric period in Greece is helpful as well, but we don't know a lot about it. But Iceland, at the time when literacy was at about this level in society, where economic documents are abundant, but literary texts are completely oral, this is a society that we actually know a lot about, because later Iceland continued to write about what had happened at this time. We have later written down accounts of what life was like in that time period, and so my Icelandic analogies will be useful in the second part of what I'm going to present as well. To summarize this first half, we have to get out of our heads the faulty model of oral and then written. There is no simple linear progression from one to the other. It was a mixed economy of oral and written societies. And if I'm right, circulating only in writing would have been virtually unknown in ancient Israel. At a certain point, once writing does take off, I think that a text circulating orally only was probably equally rare, and that for many centuries both continued alongside each other. If you look at the handout that I've given you, there's a chart that I've copied at the top of the first page that was, this comes out of the study of Icelandic literature, and the point it's trying to make is that written texts circulate in spoken form long after they're committed to writing. And the recited form of a written text can then spawn other recited forms that are not what's written on the page. And then someone can later write that down and the whole thing starts all over again. It's not a line, it's an intricate weave of a sweater where the threads of oral and written continue in and out. Oral texts circulate from a person performing to an audience, to another person performing, to a person writing, back to a person performing what was written, and then on into other written and oral forms. The Arabic example, and you could trace this one in parts of Egypt and North Africa as early or as late as 100 years ago, maybe even 70 years ago, of a very long epic story called the Sirat Bani Hilal. And the Sirat Bani Hilal is a book that you can buy, but it's also something you could go and hear performed. But what you heard performed would not be exactly any copy you would buy, because it's both. It continues to develop as a written form. You could buy two different copies that would read somewhat differently, but also as this oral form, either of them, and yet draws on maybe the latest written copy draws on a particularly famous performer's performance. That's what I think was happening in Israel. Things weaving back and forth between writing and orality. Now, my next question. When you are talking about oral performance, what do you mean? Again, our model derived from is the guy sitting around the campfire and perhaps talking to father to son, something like this. I wanted to come up with a more precise model, and I wanted to do it from two angles. One was to use ancient Middle Eastern evidence from at least the cultures surrounding Israel, if not from Israel itself. There's not a lot. This is a limited amount of material. So I supplemented this with my Icelandic analogy. And it's not Icelandic literature in particular. It's one particular kind of performed literature out of Iceland that most closely resembles what I think the literature in Israel. And so that I'll use to supplement the little bit I can get from the ancient world. If we start with the ancient world, Egypt. In Egypt, we have lots of depicted scenes, chanting of something like this. Interestingly, the Egyptian performers always have their eyes closed in a sort of rapt pose, and have compared some folk singers in modern cultures of the world where this is actually quite common. And so you can see in the example I gave there where he has his eyes closed. The verb that's used for how you pronounce oral tale basically means recite or pronounce, and so that's rather vague. That doesn't tell you much. Is this speaking? Is this singing? It's not clear. We do have one story that describes an imaginary, perhaps, scene of a performance of literature. I'm not talking about singing songs, but actually performing literature. It's a tale or a papyrus called King Cheops and the Magicians. And this tells the story of Cheops, or Khufu, who's one of the builders of one of the great pyramids. And it says that his son, Khafra, rose up to speak